I want to be respectful of everybody's schedule for today. I want to say welcome and thank you for joining us. Tilmanam, good morning, or Chumanam, good afternoon, depending on what time zone you're in. Bonjour, if you're here in my area. Again, thank you for joining us. This is the second part of a series that we're doing with the American Indian in the classroom. And we're going to be addressing many factors that impact our American Indian and Alaska Native students with their opportunities for success. We know there are a lot of wonderful things being done across Indian country, but we also know we need to do a better job in academics. We're going to address the factor with the lack of representation in schools' curriculum, with teachers and staff, and even the school environment that our children attend. We're going to offer some insights on culturally relevant pedagogy and how it is paramount for schools and educators in order to address the issues that our children have. And we know that it can improve better opportunities and outcomes for our Native children. Our presenter is going to speak on current data, as well as cultural content in schools and culturally relevant teachings. Y'all see this screen? Thumbs up? Yes, thank you.
Yes.
Just trying to make sure I can see people so I can still admit them. Today's event is going to be brought to you by the National American Indian Alaska Native MHTTC with our K-12 initiative, as well as the Traumatic Stress Initiative Category 2. Again, this is a second part in a series looking at the culturally and identity safe schools for Native youth. We're located at the University of Iowa, and we're a part of a much larger picture, the National MHTTC network, serving American Indian and Alaska Native children across the US, including Alaska. We provide technical assistance for our students and their tribal communities, schools, administrators, tribal leaders, and we have several ongoing initiatives and projects for our students and their families. The National American Indian Alaska Native Mental Health Technology Transfer Center is supported by a grant from SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. The content of this event is the creation of our presenter, Dr. Gonzalez, and the opinions expressed do not necessarily reflect the views or policies of SAMHSA, HHS, or our center. A few housekeeping rules, if I may. We know that there's going to be a difference of opinion sometimes. We know that sometimes folks have a different perspective on life. We want to ask that you please be respectful of the diverse opinions that are going to be shared today. You'll also need to be advised that this is going to be recorded, and you will be receiving a follow-up email, which will include the link to the slide deck, as well as the recording for your viewing later. In addition to that, we have something that's very important to our center. It is a survey, and it's important because it helps our funders know, it ensures that they know that our events are beneficial to those that attend. We ask that you please participate. It only takes a few minutes. It is voluntary, but we ask that you please participate. You can skip any questions if you'd like, and know that your responses are kept confidential and they cannot be linked to you. If you have questions about the survey, you can ask myself or any of our staff, many of whom will be listed at the end of the presentation. Throughout the chat, I will present the hyperlink that takes you to that survey. And at the very end, I'll share a QR code for those of you who are tech savvy, and as well as that hyperlink once again.
Hi, Allison. Before you move forward, it's so great to be here. I just, if you would go up and hit your display settings and switch the presenter view, then because we're all able to see your notes. Yeah, right there. That's perfect.
I appreciate
Now we've
it.
got the full screen, Allison. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Steve. What's really important to our staff and our community is that we pay respect to where we come from. And so although we're gathered virtually here today, it's really important that we take the time to acknowledge our land and pay respect to our indigenous nations whose homelands were forcibly taken and inhabited. Here before you have a land acknowledgement that was created by 3 of our staff members, Keely Driscoll, Ella Driscoll, and Sean Bear. To create our programs and projects takes a team. I don't do this alone. And so I would like to introduce you to some of our team members who helped create this presentation. We have one of our co-directors, Teresa Brewington. She oversees the K-12 supplement, as well as the National American Indian Alaska Native Child Traumatic Stress Initiative, Category 2. She's an enrolled member of the Kohari tribe and a descendant of the Lumbee tribe. She holds 2 master's degrees, and she's currently working on her PhD, and she currently resides at the Meskwaki settlement in Iowa. I'm Dr. Allison Bays, and I serve as the program manager for the K-12 initiative. I've done many research projects and created several programs alongside students and their families working towards their academic success. A lot of my expertise has been in education, focusing with K-12 children and their families, as well as higher ed environments. Most of my research focuses on best practices from a Native cultural lens. And I am from the Tapilam Poitecan Nation in South Texas. Here before you, you see our other team members. We have 4 ladies serving in our office right now at this time, all who are currently working on graduate degrees in mental health. And here's our speaker for today, Dr. John Gonzalez. He's Ojibwe from the White Earth Anishinaabe Nation and a professor of psychology at Bemidji State University, where he also received his undergraduate degree in psychology. He earned his doctorate in clinical psych from the University of North Dakota. Dr. Gonzalez's professional interests are in cultural psychology, multicultural psychology, and community psychology. All of these areas come together to provide a holistic view of people and their environments. His research interests are in the areas of mental and behavioral health for Indigenous people and ethnic minorities. He has investigated the racial experiences of American Indian students, as well as Native peoples' racial experiences accessing healthcare. He also has an expertise in multicultural and Indian education, serving on the Indian Education Parent and as a school board member for Independent School District number 31 with Bemidji area schools. And so now I'd like to turn the floor over to Dr. Gonzalez.
I better unmute. I started talking and no one can hear me. Miigwech, Buju, everybody. Let me go ahead and quickly, am I able to, can you make me a co-host so I can share my screen as well? Sorry.
Yes, you should.
Okay, there we go. I think I can do this now here. So we should be back to, can you all see the presentation with the screen that where Allison left off? Yes, okay. All right, Buju, everybody. Akawe, Makade, Maingan Indigenous Cause, Kawa Babi Ganikagin Donjiba, Ajijik Indodame. First thing I want to do, of course, is introduce myself in my native language. I mean, you know, you got the sort of formal professional introduction to who I am, but you know, I always like to start off with a little bit of an introduction about a little bit more of a personal introduction to sort of let people know who I am. All of these should pop up here. And where I come from, you know, my dad always taught me that, you know, when you try to, you know, present or speak in front of folks, that, you know, people need to know who you are, and that the spirits also need to know who you are as well too. So a little bit more about myself before we jump into, some of the formal stuff today here. So yes, that's me in the middle. And, for folks who were here last week, you can, kind of a refresher here for those as well. So that's me in the middle of it. That was, me way back in the 1970s. That's your 70s Indian look there. I was a little res kid growing up on, White Earth on the reservation down there. Had the real thick, bandana going on for the headband and everything. So it's like, every time I look at that, it's like, wow, who's that kid, but, that kid there actually didn't graduate from high school. That's another part of my story. I was, I'm one of those students. I was one of those students that are in your classrooms today that really struggled, with my K through 12 education, experienced a lot of racism, didn't see myself in the curriculum, didn't see myself in the school, didn't see myself at the front of the classroom, just felt like, I did not belong there, and that was not a place for me, right? So I struggled with that and, end up actually getting expelled from the 9th grade. So I never graduated from high school. Once I was expelled, I was 16 already and never went back, ended up getting my GED later on that year, and then got into all kinds of trouble, which is a whole nother story. But found myself in and out of treatment, in and out of jail, lots of different, caused lots of pain and hurt a lot of people along the way. And then, finally, after some, real bad things happened to me and others, decided, that I needed to do something different with my life. And it's a person in the top left-hand corner there, my dad, whose name is Jim Ironlegs Weaver. Some folks might know who that person is. He was famous or infamous in Indian country, depending on who you asked, I suppose. But he was an activist. He was a rebel. He's a boarding school survivor. There's an irony, which I'll get to a little bit later, that, he was the one who always stressed it. We got to get an education. I wish I would have listened to him when I was younger, but I didn't. But, after everything was said and done and I'm sitting in jail and he comes and, says, okay, this is what you got to do. I finally did listen to him and went to college and, decided to do something different with my life. So I give thanks to him for many things. The folks down in the lower right-hand corner, that person in the middle, that's my mom. Her name is Judith Belcourt. And then, of course, those are her brothers next to her there. And again, some folks might recognize those guys in Indian country. That's Vernon and Clyde Belcourt. And, again, they might sound familiar, but Vernon and Clyde, well, Clyde in particular is one of the co-founders of the American Indian movement. It started back in the late 1960s, right here in Minnesota, down in Minneapolis. And then Vernon joined them a little bit later and was active in AIM and in representing the American Indian movement. So I have that in my family. It's in my history. It's a part of who I am. It really has shaped the worldview that I have about being a Native person, growing up in this society and so on. So it was those folks were around when I was young, growing up, and really kind of helped shape my thoughts and the importance of speaking up and doing something to help your people and so on, right? Up in the upper right hand corner, that's my family there. That's my wife Nanako, who's Japanese from Japan. We met as undergraduate students actually here at BSU 20 some years ago now, and those are our 3 children there. That photo is actually taken at my mom's, where I grew up on Snyder Lake. It's right in the middle of the White Earth Indian Reservation there. And then down in the lower left-hand corner, that's a picture of me and my youngest son a while back, where we went to one of the schools here in Bemidji, and that's Larry Yazzie. Some folks might recognize Larry Yazzie. He's actually from the Meskwaki Indian settlement in Iowa, lives in Minneapolis now, but he comes up and has a little dance troupe, and we participated in sharing some Native powwow culture, at least within the school system there. So again, I share those little pieces of myself to give folks a little bit more sense of who I am and where I come from, and why I feel I can speak to what I'm about to speak to today, based on my sort of life experience of being a Native person going through the education system, and now being in a position to do what I do now and so on. So So moving on here, again, a little bit of an outline of what I'm hoping to be able to accomplish today. And get through again, I mean, I know for some folks who were here with us last week, there's going to be a little quick sort of refresher in terms of this historical context, try to link that historical context in terms of Indian education to the contemporary context, and then more specifically within the curriculum and representation or lack of representation or sometimes misrepresentation that happens within our school system, school systems, I guess. And then, sort of transition and really start talking about what is, culturally relevant or responsive teaching pedagogy. And then, I'm a scientist, I'm a data guy, and I think data is important. And so I'm going to go through some research and talk about what's the evidence and how effective culturally responsive teaching can be for people of color and for American Indians specifically, right? So that's my goal for today, and we'll hopefully we'll have enough time to get there. So, all right. So quick, again, refresher. Just in terms of Indian education and the history of Indian education in our country. Again, Native folks, we have a very unique relationship with formal education. Certainly it goes back to the boarding school era. Again, this should be Indian Ed 101. And I'm hoping everybody who's, with us today has a basic understanding of this, right? I mean, and I have to always talk about this and share this, because this is something that's had one of the most profound impacts on Native people today, right? In terms of shaping our worldviews, shaping our perspectives, having an impact on the issues that still plague our communities, in terms of social issues, behavioral issues, health issues, and so on, but certainly education, right? I mean, the idea that, that the boarding school era happened where children were taken from their families, sent sometimes hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles away, cannot be understated, right? In terms of the trauma that has created within our societies, which still is with us today, right? So again, not going to go through this whole history, but we know that it happened. It started in the late 1800s, went on for about 60, almost 70 years, right, before it was finally sort of formally ended as a I guess a program or a policy for by the federal government. Again, Richard Pratt was the person who's known to have started this process. Had the Carlisle Institute, in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. This is a picture again of hundreds of Native kids that went through, and in fact, there was thousands of Native kids that went through Carlisle, but there was, boarding schools all over the country, right? It wasn't just Carlisle. I mean, there were two different, I don't know if they're styles, but two different types of boarding schools. You had the BIA, which is under the Bureau of Indian Affairs, right? And the Bureau of Indian Education. Those are these government-run schools. Those are just a couple of examples of those in terms of where those were. Around the country, there was almost 100 of those at one given time. And then there was these mission-run schools where the government contracted with churches, and the churches, in fact, actually divided up the country. If you look at this history and said, we'll take this part of the country, you take that part of the country, and so on. And there's just a couple of examples of those, and or places in terms of where those were. There was, a few right here in Minnesota, Pipestone, in fact, which is at the border of Minnesota and South Dakota, just west of Minneapolis. That's actually where my dad was sent. So my dad was born in the 20s. They came and got him when he was about 6 or 7, sent him to Pipestone, Minnesota. He was there until he was about 13 or so, when he ran away and he escaped from the boarding school there. His parents and grandparents actually died when he was at boarding school, so he never got to see them again, and was basically on his own from that time on, right? So, he has those stories, and I have those stories. I carry those stories with me, just like lots of you Native folks that are with us here today. You have relatives that survived the boarding schools, and certainly some that didn't, right? But even though we may have not been in boarding schools ourselves, we carry those stories with us, and we continue to carry that trauma and that pain with us, and it cannot be understated in terms of how impactful that really was. Again, at one point in time, there was probably over 20,000 students, within the boarding schools, both the BIA ones and the mission ones, across the country. And of course, these were not, they were not fun. I mean, they were, the conditions themselves were very traumatizing, right? I mean, the poor nutrition, improper, clothing, harsh punishments. There was rampant physical and sexual abuse that happened. Disease, was rampant within them. The boys basically did hard labor for half the day, and then we're in the classrooms for the other half the day. That the girls, did sort of household duties. They learned how to cook and sew and clean for half the day, and then they were in the classrooms half the day, right? And literally hundreds, if not thousands, of Native children died while they were at boarding schools. There's literally graveyards outside these boarding schools across the country for children that never got to go home, right? So again, just, I share that, right? Just to sort of, so we understand just how much of an impact that has had on our Native communities, where families never got to see their children again, and children never got to see their families again, right? And it's still with us today. And the effects of that are still with us today, right? In terms of how that shaped our relationship with education, of course, it leads to these major trust issues that we have with formal education, with our K through 12 systems, and certainly even higher education, right? I shared a couple of stories about that last week, with my mom. In particular, my mom actually did not get sent away to boarding schools. Instead, she went to a mission school that was right in the village of White Earth. My mom was born right in the village of White Earth. And then there was a mission, a Catholic school that was right there in town. And she went to that, but got to come home during the day. But, still did not have a pleasant experience with education, even though she was not sent away to boarding school. And as a result of that, I had struggled with school, and I didn't like to go to school, and she was okay with me not going to school, right? So it really had an impact in terms of absenteeism that I experienced, growing up, and it's still happening today. I shared the story last week that there's times when my mom was taking care of a couple of her grandchildren, and I would call her up and see how she's doing. She lives about an hour away from me, just on the road, about 60 miles, where I grew up down there, from Bemidji. And, I would call her up and just, how you doing? Just checking in, see how things are going. And then I would hear my nephew in the background. I'm like, it's Wednesday afternoon, at 1 o'clock. How come, Jesse's not in school? Right. And she goes, oh, I, just didn't feel like sending. He didn't want to go today. So I didn't, it's okay. And I'm like, Mom, Jesse has to go to school. I mean, it's a school day or whatever, So, I mean, again, you can draw a direct line from the boarding school era that our aunties and our moms and our dads and our grandparents experienced in that relationship with education, to absenteeism today in terms of our relationship and our attitudes towards education, right? We have these trust issues. There's still this idea within Native communities that education is equal to assimilation, because again, boarding school was never about education. It was always, and it was only about assimilating us, or attempting to assimilate Native people, to become white people, basically, right? There's still these ideas that, when Native people get educated, that we've been whitewashed. I experienced that, as someone who's gone through higher education, and, go back to the community sometimes, and some of my cousins and relatives, think that I'm different. I mean, I am different in some ways, but I'm still that same little res kid, that grew up on the res, but, they see me as being different because I went through education, right? It certainly has an impact in terms of these achievement and what I think is more opportunity gaps. And then because continued oppression still happens within our education system, which I'm going to get to here in just a little bit, in terms of discrimination and racism and the various types of microaggressions that happened, right? And here's the legacy of that, right? I mean, again, this is for Minnesota specifically, but I'm sure that if you were to look at, any of your own states, there's not much variation in this. I mean, there are some states that actually probably have, somewhere in the almost 70 to 80% of their Native students that are graduating from high school. But the majority of states that have higher Native populations, it tends to be much less than that. In Minnesota, unfortunately, it always hovers around 50%. Literally only half of our Native kids are graduating from high school here in Minnesota. In fact, we live in this paradox in Minnesota where, on the one hand, we're always in the top 10 in terms of graduation rates, and, have this so-called great, education system here in Minnesota. but that's not true for students of color, and it's definitely not true for Native students here in Minnesota, where literally only half of them are graduating from high school, right? And there's lots of reasons for that, which we're going to get into a little bit today, right? This is, data from about 2 years ago. I think the new data is coming out here anytime from the Department of Education, and I doubt it's going to change much, because if you look at this graph, it shows you that it really hasn't changed, over the last 7 to 8 years. The blue line at the bottom is Native students, right? And we're always, at the bottom of the list or the top of the list, depending on how you frame that, right? In terms of graduation rates here in Minnesota for Native kids, right? So, we've got an issue that needs to be addressed. And I know that, we're all here because we want to address that issue. We're all here because we care about that issue. Again, it's, and people who go into education obviously care about, education and care about kids and all of that or whatever. So, we've got to figure out what the issue is and what the problem is and how to address that issue, right? On a more sort of systemic level. So in terms of how that oppression continues to happen and how it results in education disparities, there's several reasons for that. And I've come to sort of learn and understand that it's multifaceted. It's not sort of just one simple thing, right? But, one of the things that we often forget in our training to become educators is thinking about what education actually is in the sense that it's really embedded in and based on these cultural worldviews. We sometimes forget that. We sort of assume, especially the Western model of education assumes that there's one way to educate people, right? And of course, that's a cultural worldview. That's a cultural lens, and we often forget what exactly that means and how important that actually is, right? That not everybody learns the same way, and not everybody sort of has the same idea in terms of what education actually is and who's an educator and what it means, right? I'll get into a little bit more about that here in a second. And then, of course, within that, I really believe that one of the primary issues that our Native kids and other students of color experience has to do with the curriculum issues themselves and what's taught, how it's taught, and what's not taught within our classrooms and within our school buildings, right? And again, I'm going to jump back into this, for this image here is from one of Sherman Alexi's books, right? And it kind of just shows you, how when our Native kids go to school, they're sort of, given all of these different doses of, American idealism and Christianity and, and all of those kinds of things there. We're sort of served that up on a daily basis, right? And we never sort of see ourselves within the curriculum and so on, right? So again, jumping into this idea, again, of cultural models of education, what is this talking about? What does this mean? Which we often forget and we kind of take for granted, right? Especially if you've been formally trained as an educator within our education system itself, right? We forget that, that models of education are culturally based, right? That they're situated and there are a set of ideas about what does it mean, to be a student or a good student, what is the role of education in becoming a good person? What is that idea or the nature of relationships between teachers and students? Those are all culturally formulated. Those are all culturally bound, right? And not every single, different cultural group around the world has the same ideas about that. It doesn't mean the same thing. And that's true for Native folks and Indigenous folks around the world, and certainly here on Turtle Island, right? It also incorporates these frequently practiced ways of teaching, studying, evaluating students, rewarding students or learners, right, in our classrooms. These are all based on cultural practices and cultural norms, right? And they vary. And going the wrong way, and they vary across that. And again, there's these conventional patterns and interactions between teachers and students, right? So folks, some of you might know about Stephanie Freiberg. She's a Native woman, Tulalip, from Washington State, also a psychologist. Her and one of her mentors, did a few studies a few years back to, kind of really flush this out. And she did a study, well, a couple of studies I'm going to reference today. One of them in particular, where she looked at this, particularly for students who went through the K through 12 education, and basically asked some basic questions. What comes to mind when you think about education? what comes to mind when you think about a teacher, right? And she asked both white students and Native students. And here's basically some of the responses. This was both a qualitative and a quantitative study that she did. So when you ask this question, these are some typical responses that you would get from European American or white students. When you think of education, what comes to mind? And so they would say things like that education is a key to successful, happy, professional future, or it's the freedom to think and express your own ideas, in comparison to what, course materials are taught and so on, right? These are typical responses for white students, but for Native students, these are some of the typical responses that you would see and that you would hear, right? That I think of the reservation because I was educated on the reservation where education was horrible. Or they think about education as something that's oral learning, something that's passed down from your elders, to the grandchildren, or from your parents to you, and so on, right? So just looking at those responses, you can see that there's there's a different worldview here, right? A different perspective in terms of what does education actually mean when you ask people from different cultural backgrounds, right? Of course, they asked some other questions, like I said, and got some quantitative data, and the stuff that's highlighted there in red is where you really see some statistical significant differences between white folks and Native folks when you ask them what comes to mind when you think of education, right? And a couple of those in particular, for most non-Native folks, they typically think of education as a tool for success individually, right? But for Native folks, it's more seen of as a communal process or something that's going to help your community. And that's where you see in that third to the bottom last line there, right? In terms of 21% of the students sort of see it, Native students see it as a tool for community success in terms of moving my community ahead, versus only 5% of the non-Native students think of it or think about education sort of as that way, right? And then of course you see the negative view of education. Again, it has to do with our relationship with education and so on. And then interestingly enough, literally no non-Native student thought about their family when they thought about education, but almost 20% of those students, Native students, thought about their family when they thought about education, right? So again, just looking at the data, you can clearly see that there's some real differences in worldviews and perspectives about what education actually means, or what education actually is, between natives and non-natives, right? Similarly, again, I mentioned that, that she asked the question, okay, what comes to mind when you think of a teacher? And again, these are the typical responses that you would get from non-native or European American students. Again, a teacher should, be encouraging, help students to think for themselves, or, it's a helper in the quest for learning. Again, formally, one who instructs, directs, and so on and so forth, right? But typical responses from Native students are completely different from that, unfortunately. You would get things like, I think of a white teacher back on the reservation, who thought that we were all slow, so they never really challenged us. Or again, linking it back to family and sort of a different perspective about who's a teacher, or who's, who has knowledge and can share knowledge. That I typically think of someone who's older than me, usually my parents or elders. I guess they were my first teachers. Again, this will come back to us later. I'll show you some more data that sort of looks at this, and you see this relationship again as well too. So again, you see very stark differences in terms of typical types of responses to that question between white Americans and American Indians when they asked, what do you think about when you think about a teacher, or what comes to mind when you think about a teacher, and so on, right? Similarly, some quantitative data to kind of go along with this as well. Again, you see in red, they're highlighted, where you see those real statistically significant differences between white Americans and American Indians, right? In terms of who's a role model or a mentor versus, having a negative view of a teacher. And then, again, thinking about some family members or relatives as teachers, or, when they think about what comes to mind when you think of a teacher, again, someone who's a parent or a grandparent or an elder, really stands out for Native folks, right? So again, we have these very different perspectives in terms of what education is, and then who's a provider of knowledge, who's a keeper of wisdom, and who can be a teacher, and who are your first teachers, right? So very, again, this really emphasizes and provides us some evidence that there's these different perspectives, different worldviews about what education is, the importance of education, and then who is an educator or who is a teacher, and where does knowledge come from, right? Those things are important, because if our students are thinking have a different perspective about what education is, the purpose of education, how useful education can be, who's a teacher, and so on, it's broader than someone just standing in front of the classroom, that's going to impact how well they're going to receive our lessons. Does that make sense? I mean, I'm hoping that makes sense to folks, sort of just, hearing me sort of talk that out. There was a little bit more data that Freiberg and Marcus collected. When they put this all together, they ran this thing called a regression analysis. Again, for you non-statistical folks in the audience here, a regression analysis is basically looking at relationships between variables, and you try to use a bunch of relationships between variables to predict some outcome, right? And in this case, they try to use those relationships between variables to predict grades, right? What led to higher grades for Native students and white students, right? And looking at this, let me kind of just sort of interpret the data here for you guys, right? So you can clearly see, looking at these, that there's different sort of numbers, and the asterisk tells you how significant the relationship actually is, or how significant that prediction actually is in terms of predicting grades for either Native students or white students. And one of the two of the most powerful predictors for American Indian students was whether or not that they could trust their teachers, whether or not that they felt that they could trust their teachers. Translation here is that they had a relationship with their teachers, had a positive relationship with their teachers, the meaning that they could trust them, right? That was the most single largest predictor for good grades for American Indian students. And you can see that it wasn't a predictor for non-Native students, for white students, right? And then there's this other thing, which I talked a little bit about last week, which I'll also talk about here in a second, because it has to do with, again, how we approach whether or not you were coming from a collectivistic perspective versus an individualistic perspective. And this has to do with the way that we see ourselves in terms of interdependent versus independent, right? Because in our Western model of education, we typically tend to emphasize an independent value, that you have to be your own person, you're responsible for your behavior, you're responsible for your grades, and you have to be the best and do the best that you can at the expense of others. That's a value that American society teaches, and it happens in our classrooms, right? American Indian people are not necessarily that way. I mean, yes, there's some of us that are sort of individualistic and so on, but as a whole, we tend to be much more interdependent, right? That we tend to want cooperation. We tend to focus on harmony, keeping balance. We care about the family. We care about family members and others. We care about our classmates. We don't want to be in competition with them. So this sense that, having an interdependent sense of self was also a very strong predictor for American Indian students. And you see that again here. I don't know if you all can see my cursor moving around here, where that wasn't a predictor and it was the opposite for non-Native students. So again, what this tells us, right, is that you as a teacher in the classroom, or even an educator in your school, is that the relationships that you have with your Native students are probably one of the most important things in terms of those students being successful. Right? I mean, that's what the data says. It's right there in our face, right? That's the strongest predictor of grades of our students being successful, is making sure that you have strong relationships and that student can trust you in the classroom and in the school building. I mean, I could stop right there, and hopefully that would be the end of our conversation. Unfortunately, there's a little bit more to that. I mean, I found the same thing actually at the college level, interestingly enough. That's a whole nother presentation, but real quick, I mean, I did a similar study to this. And one of the things that predicted success for students at the university was that they had at least one or a few teachers that they could trust. And in fact, it was the non-Native teachers, not necessarily the Native teachers on campus. Yes, those were important, but they could identify one non-Native professor that they felt that they could trust, that they could go to. That was a very powerful predictor for them being successful at the college level, right? So, I mean, you just can't, stress this enough. It's really, really important, okay? Okay, moving on. I'll save some time for questions and comments at the end as well too. So again, moving on, again, I want to spend a lot of time on the curriculum issues because there's a lot more to sort of get you or whatever, but I'm hoping people, I'm just going to go through these things real quickly. Columbus, I know that we talked about this last week. I mean, I'm hoping people are sort of understanding that, that this is, the way that we talk about Columbus. I use these as simple examples, but there's, it's embedded across the curriculum, how we talk about history, how we talk about certain people, how we teach about certain people, right? I mean, really what this is getting at is whose version of history is taught. And Columbus is sort of one of those, that sort of just is easy to sort of show the negative impact that this has on Native people, because that person represents sort of the beginning of colonization and oppression, right, for Native people. But I share this, right, because look at, this slide here. These are literally things that my kids brought home from school. I took pictures of these and put them into the slide. These are literally lessons. I don't know if you even want to call them lessons that my children brought home from school from kindergarten and first grade in terms of how they introduce Columbus as this happy, jolly dude who, forget about the slaughtering, all of the slaughtering that he did of Native people and how much, this indoctrination, if we want to talk about indoctrination, this starts in kindergarten. This starts in first grade, right? I mean, so sometimes, I get a little worked up, so I'm going to try to sort of keep my cool here and try to move on, from this, whatever. But, again, just stop and think about that for a second. And I'm here in Bemidji, Minnesota. We literally have 3 of the largest Native reservations in Minnesota surround Bemidji. We got White Earth to the southwest, we got Red Lake to the north, and we got Leech Lake to the east of us, within 15-20-minute drive, right? The population of Native people in Bemidji is about 20% or so. In our schools, it's about 20%. I mean, I can understand maybe this happening, in some place where, you've got, very few Native people still around, but this, we're surrounded by Native people here, and this is happening in our schools. And when this stuff happens, of course I got to go to the school. And one of the reasons why I ran for school board, in fact, was because of shit like this, happening. I mean, I've got story after story after story, which I'm sure that each one of you have as well, right? Thanksgiving, don't even get me going, right? How Thanksgiving has been portrayed, how it continues to be portrayed. Again, as Native people, of course, we know all about giving thanks, right? I mean, we give thanks all the time, right? So it's not an issue in terms of, about Thanksgiving itself or giving thanks and being grateful and things like that. The issue is how we teach Thanksgiving, right? How we link that to Pilgrims and Indians, when that's actually not even the real reason why we have Thanksgiving holiday as a nation. I mean, it didn't, Thanksgiving as a holiday didn't even start until after the Civil War, right? I mean, but we don't teach that in school. We teach that if they're, in the issue here, here's the real crux of the issue, is that if we teach Thanksgiving, like I have on the screen, that it's linked to the Pilgrims and Indians at Plymouth Rock, that erases all of the history. That erases all of the genocide. It sort of portrays this watered down version that Indians and Pilgrims have gotten along, and we've all gotten along ever since. That's the real crux of the issue, right? Because then we see images like this, which is reversed, right? The reverse of sort of history here, a revision of history where, it's the Pilgrims who are providing, food and, welcoming, the natives, when it was, the complete opposite around. This is one of the most famous images, right, that we see about Thanksgiving that's sort of perpetuated and sent, through our school system, right? Again, I'm going to move on here, rather quickly. Again, coming back to history, whose heroes, whose values are taught, and so on, right? So that's that's sort of the historical link to the contemporary, how it continues to happen. What does the data actually show today in terms of what's being taught in the classroom, what's not being taught in the classroom, how it's being taught, and then how can we move forward from there, right? So I'm going to go through some data real quick that, that comes straight from, this is actually hot off the press. This is the most recent National Indian Education Study that was published, actually, I think only a couple of months ago, right, under the U.S. Department of Education. Some of you are probably, part of this data. In fact, they try to do it like every 5 to 8 years or something like that there. So here's the states that are actually included in this data. And they do this as part of this, again, national education or, North American education sort of report that's put out by the Department of Education. And they survey teachers and students at both the 4th grade level and the 8th grade level, right? And then they have 3 different types of schools that they identify within this study. You have low density schools, high density schools, and then BIE schools. So the definition for those is that low density schools are any schools that have their native student population is less than 25%. High density schools that their native student population is more than 25%. And then of course, BIE schools are your Bureau of Indian Education schools. So we have a couple of them right here in Minnesota. On my reservation, we have Circle of Life Academy, which is a BIE school. It's a tribally run school. Over on Leech Lake, they have the Buganagijic tribal school over there. So there's many of these across the country where the tribe, basically runs the school, but it's through the Bureau of Indian Education. So some of you are probably working at those schools, so you should know what I'm talking about, right? And then you see how the different states were added over time, and these are the states that are represented in this data, right? Okay, so let's jump into the data. I'm going to go through this somewhat relatively quickly. This report is actually free and readily available. Some of you probably already have it and probably have seen this data. If you haven't, I can provide the link to Dr. Bays after this as well too, and she can share that with folks, although they probably already have it, I'm hoping. So, okay, so, this new study actually has a bunch of different additional data that they didn't ask in previous versions of the survey, where they, so, one of the new things that they asked in this new version is, the types of different cultural knowledge that students actually had, and then who taught them that, or where did they learn that knowledge, I guess, right? So, so a couple of questions I'm going to quickly go through here. So again, here's one: how much do you know about about your American Indian tribe or Alaska Native group? For example, you may know your history, your traditions, arts and crafts of your tribe, and so on, right? Again, at the 4th grade level and at the 8th grade level. And then the numbers in here are percentages of students who said this, right? And depending on the type of school, low density, high density, tribal schools, and then all together, this is the summarization here, right? So you can see, right, that it varies. This one is kind of spread out quite a bit. You can see, right, that on average, students are saying, especially at the lower grades, right, not very much, or a little to, to some. Not a lot of them are saying a lot. But then when you get to 8th grade, you see, there's those numbers increase, and then certainly in the tribal schools, these 8th graders are learning more, or they know more, right, about their tribe's history or traditions and arts and crafts and things like that. So that's not too terribly surprising. What's interesting though is when you ask them who taught you what you know, and this again comes back to that study by Freiberg in terms of it shows that family members, right, who's a teacher, who has the knowledge. And you can clearly see that, at both the 4th grade level and the 8th grade level, in terms of where the students are learning about their history or learning about their traditions and customs and cultural pathways and things like that, there is that family members are the primary providers of that knowledge, right? Again, not surprising, because we know that, again, that Native folks, we should be doing this, of course, but my point will be a little bit later that we can do more of this within the school systems themselves, right? So again, that's not terribly surprising. Similarly, again, cultural knowledge, in terms of arts and crafts, or issues in particular that are important to us today, or to Native people today. Again, you see family members are the primary people, especially at the upper grade level here, that are providing that knowledge in those lessons about issues that are important to Native people in today's society, right? You sort of see that they were learning this stuff at home and not necessarily at school. And I would argue that we need to do more of this in the schools, especially this modern time stuff in terms of what's happening with Native people today, right? And there's different ways to do that. And again, I'll jump to that here in a little bit, right? This one, the next sort of set of questions get specifically into different types of topics that are taught in school. So language arts, math, science, things like that there, right? So this question here specifically is, how often do you integrate materials about American Indian culture or history into your reading? And you sort of see, again, a little bit of a breakdown, but I'm hoping people are picking up on something really, really important here, is that, first of all, it's not happening enough. And second of all, both at the 4th grade level and at the 8th grade level, the most common answer, of course, is at least once a year, right? Now, oh, sorry, let me go back. At least once a year, right? That this is the question that's asked for teachers, asked to teachers, right? How often do you integrate materials about American Indian culture or history into your reading or your language art lessons? And then again, the most common response is at least once a year, at least at the public schools. At the tribal schools, it tends to be more spread across the year, but at the public schools, it tends to be only once a year, right? And again, you see that same pattern in terms of reading literature. You know, how often are you have your students read Native authors? You know, how often do you have your students read about, discuss current issues or concerns to the American Indian community, both at the 4th grade level and the 8th grade level? Again, if you can't see the sort of, I know this is a lot of data on the screen here right now, but if you can't see it, I'll point it out for you. The most common response, of course, is once a year. And of course, we know when that is, right? Can I get a couple of head nods from folks here? Or do I got to point that? I mean, November, it's either around Thanksgiving, we're talking about American Indians, or during the month of November sometime, but typically around Thanksgiving, right? I mean, we show up once a year, if that, right? I mean, that's part of the issue. And again, I understand that teaching's a tough gig. Teaching's a lot of work. Teachers are underpaid, overworked, right? And got a lot of things sort of going on their plates, and they're trying to do the best they can and so on. And then I know that another part of the equation here, right, is that there really isn't a lot of resources out there for teachers to use as well too, because the study or the data actually shows this as well. This is a study that was done, actually it's done more often than this, by folks at the education department over at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in their Cooperative Children's Book Center. They have sort of the center where they look at this. This study was done just a few years back that sort of tried to identify that diversity in children's books. And then you can clearly see here, it's actually it's cutting off part of my screen, unfortunately here, but the percentage wise is represented by the size of the images that you see in the background, right? So of course, that's us over here at the very far left. I mean, for Native folks, we barely got a handful of anything. Latinx, that's the next person, the kid in the yellow there, right, has a tiny little mirror. They can barely see themselves. Asian folks, a little bit more, Black folks, a little bit more, but, animals, a whole bunch, right? And then of course, white Americans, they're overrepresented in terms of children representation and diversity in children's books, right? I mean, so that's part of the problem right there, is that we just there's just a lack of representation and a lack of resources in general, right? So I understand that, of course, it's going to take a little bit more work. It's going to take a little bit more research. It's going to take a little bit more time, to find those resources that you might want to use in your classroom. Of course, that's understandable, right? But at the same time, if you have Native kids in your classroom, in your school, you need to do this work, because we're literally failing half of our kids, right? This is part of the reason why we're failing half of our kids, because we don't see ourselves in the curriculum. We don't see ourselves in the books. We don't see ourselves on the walls. We just don't see ourselves. So then that sends a message. There's an underlying message there that we don't belong there, that that's not the place for us. That's the issue, right? The same thing across other topics in school, mathematics, right? You know, you see a similar pattern. Again, this is the data. This is what the data is showing. You ask these teachers, and how often do you integrate materials about, you know, American Indian culture or history into your mathematics lessons? Again, you see this. The most common pattern is actually here, never. Not even once a year. The most common pattern is never. I mean, math is math, right? I mean, you know, adding and subtracting, dividing and, you know, multiplying, right? I mean, how am I going to integrate native? I mean, well, you can do that. Actually, there's a way to do that. And I'll give you a couple of examples. Actually, I'll give you an example right now, right? You know, I mean, the typical word problem, right? I mean, you know, Susie, you know, needs to, you know, get from point A to point B to ride the bus or whatever. I mean, there's ways that we can incorporate American Indian culture into math. Up here in northern Minnesota, you know, we have this monomen, which is wild rice. Again, the folks in Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan will probably know what I'm talking about here, but we have wild rice. It's one of our sacred staple foods. It's called monomen, right? The good berry. That's culturally relevant for Native kids up here in this region. It's something really, really simple. In fact, there's a you know, one of my friends who's a big time, you know, ricer who harvests wild rice. You know, he goes out every year and takes kids out to do, you know, to harvest wild rice and so on. I mean, you could use that. I mean, because the way that you do is, you know, the way that you harvest wild rice is you take a canoe, you have two people, one person who knocks the rice into the canoe, another person who's poling behind, because the water is only about 4 or 5 feet deep, you know, and you go out there all day and you fill up your canoe. Usually, you know, some people, if they're good enough, you know, they can get like 400 or 500 pounds of green rice, right? And then you got to go and finish that rice, right? You got to dry it out, then you got to finish it, you got to parch it, you got to do all that. And then at the end of the day, if you have 400 or 500 pounds of rice, depending on how good the crop was that year, you could probably get about, you know, a couple of 100 pounds of finished rice, of wild rice, right? I mean, I'm hoping people are following me here. That's a math equation. That's a math problem right there, right? You know, so-and-so, you know, your uncle George goes and pounds, you know, gathers 500 pounds of rice. It's finishing at probably 60% or 40% on a good year. How much finished rice is he going to have after he's done? That's a simple math problem that's culturally relevant to Native students. No matter where you're from, you can find something within the culture that allow you to do that, right? Take the drum, for example. I mean, that's math. There's math that goes into building a drum and making a drum. You can use the math as a circle, pi, right? 3.145, whatever. You know, you can calculate the circumference of different sizes of drums, right? I mean, there's math everywhere in every single thing that we do, right? And you can come up with, you know, examples that are culturally relevant to the students in your classroom, right? You have a drum that's 36 inches in diameter. You know, you've got 12 singers. How much space are they going to have? Or, you know, I mean, you know, these are just off the top of my head. I mean, you know, if you take a little bit of time and put that into, you know, practice, you can, you know, you should be able to come up with lots of different things that you can do in terms of incorporating math. I mean, and even at the upper grades, you know, the way that you incorporate diversity or the way that you incorporate American Indian culture or history into your mathematics lessons is using data sets that include Native people in them, right? Students take stats now in high school. Use some data sets that include Native populations and Native communities as part of the stats that the students are doing, looking at comparisons between groups of people on important outcome measures. That's, I mean, that should be doable, right? I mean, I'm hoping, again, I can't see everybody's faces here, so I'm hoping there's some head nodding going on here in the background. I only got a couple of little pictures of folks on my screen here or whatever, right? It's not rocket science. I mean, well, you could probably even incorporate rocket science, right? I mean, yeah, I'll come back to that here in a second, right? Some other questions that they ask, which I also think is another issue or another factor that's important for us to think about relevant to culturally relevant pedagogy, is that how often are you making connections with community members, parents, aunties, uncles, in, you know, of your students in your schools, right? So this question, these are some new questions that they asked this last go around of the survey as well too, where they asked, in a typical school year, how many times has a member of the Native community visited the school to discuss education issues with students or staff, other than a conference, regarding individual or, other than, parent-teacher conferences, basically. And then unfortunately, especially in the, low density schools, it never happens. It happens a little bit more in the high density schools, but still only once or twice a year. There's even some, teachers and administrators who don't even know, that they're not even sure like how many times that happens. But, in our BIA schools, of course, our tribal schools, it's happening quite a bit more than not, both at the 4th and 8th grade level. I share this, right, because these are important. I really think that, that Native parents, Native aunties and uncles, grandparents are vital resources that schools should be utilizing to help our Native students do better. And in fact, I know that there's many, parents and grandparents and aunties and uncles that would willingly come into the schools and share their knowledge, share their areas of expertise, right? Even just being present, to help students feel more comfortable in the schools and in the classrooms and so on, right? Similarly, again, how often, do Native community members visit the school, to share about, Native culture and things like that? There again, you see a similar pattern, right? Where, maybe it's happening once or twice a year, more in our tribal schools, but not so much in our low density and our high density schools. The point here, of course, is it should be happening more. And that can be really, really powerful in terms of helping our students. So this is what the data is showing. I mean, this is, what's, again, some of you were probably part of this data set in the various places that you are in, right? Finally, with this national study, I just want to share this here because I'm going to come back to this in a second as well. They also asked, what is the percentage of Native faculty, staff and teachers in your school? And, you're probably guessing, right? Did you sort of see this sort of similar a pattern here, right? Certainly in our low density schools, as there's not many Native faculty and staff in our buildings or in the classrooms. You see a little bit more in terms of teachers and staff at the high density schools, and then certainly into tribal schools as well too. You see quite a bit more of Native faculty and staff, and of course that's good. That's what that's what we want, because the research shows that this is important. And I'm going to show you some of that research here in a little bit, right? So this is what the data is sort of telling us. There's important stories that goes along with this data, and it gives us some evidence in terms of where we need to work on things and how we can do better and improve the educational outcomes of our students. So that leads us to sort of the idea of culturally relevant or responsive teaching and how can it help, right? I'm going to go through some of this real quick and then jump into the data or some of the evidence, I guess. I'm assuming that that a bunch of you out here already sort of have a basic understanding of what culturally relevant or culturally responsive teaching is. And in fact, some of you are probably already doing it. And maybe some of you are doing it and you don't even realize that you're doing it. But I think the more of us that are doing it, the better the outcomes are going to be, not only for Native students, actually for everybody. This is the other sort of secret sort of sauce to this, is that this is a win-win, not only for Native students, it's a win-win for everybody, for the non-Native students as well, to have culturally relevant teaching and pedagogy in our classrooms, right? So what is it? Real quick, let me sort of just jump into this. I didn't make this stuff up. People have been talking about this for 20, 30 years, right? Geneva Gay is one person in particular who first sort of talking about this idea in terms of what it is, going way back to the 1990s and early 2000s, right? And here's sort of the basic definitions of what exactly is culturally responsive or culturally relevant teaching. It's the idea, right, that you're using the cultural knowledge, the prior experiences, the frame of references of our students and their families to help make learning more meaningful for those students, rather than trying to spoon feed everybody this, the same formula out of the same bowl, where only some students are going to, thrive on that, and other students are not, because it's not their sort of, cup of tea, right? You use the existing knowledge, because we have to understand that students come to us already with existing knowledge. They're learning things already from their parents and their grandparents about how to survive in the world. And we need to tap into that and use that to make what they're learning in school more relevant to them. And again, I just gave you a couple of examples about that in terms of math, right? That's the idea. That's the idea of culturally relevant teaching in a nutshell, right? And then of course, it's there's some other sort of parameters that kind of go along with that as well too. Again, the idea that you treat students as competent already, that they already have existing knowledge. They're not sort of this clean slate, right? A blank slate. I mean, they're coming to us already, right? And we need to sort of understand that, right? We try to build on their real experiences, their real life experiences, right? And we try to scaffold on that, right? What else can I say about this? I'm not going to read through each one of these, word for word, but there's 6 essential characteristics, which I'm going to go through real quick, and then we'll jump into the evidence. I'll show a bunch of different studies that showed how effective this actually is, or these methods are, I guess, for students of color and some Native students as well too. So here's the 6 essential characteristics of culturally relevant teaching, right? So first one is validating. The idea here, I'm hoping people sort of can pick up on this right away, right? I mean, basically the idea that culturally relevant teaching is validating is that it basically acknowledges and legitimizes the cultural backgrounds of our students, right? I mean, again, if you acknowledge that they coming in with their already sort of set of values, set of learning experiences, they already have this cultural knowledge that they've acquired from their parents and their aunties and their uncles and so on, and their grandparents. And that's important. I mean, everybody wants to be validated. Everybody needs to be validated in some level, right? So acknowledging that provides that validation, right? It teaches the students to know how to praise their own and other people's cultural backgrounds. That's the other thing that's validating about this, right? Again, it incorporates a multicultural framework. You try to bring in additional resources and materials that can really that they can relate to. That's the validating part of this, right? Second, comprehensive, right? Here are the ideas in terms of culturally relevant teaching being comprehensive is that the culturally responsive teacher realizes that not only the importance of academic achievement, but also in sort of maintaining and helping build that person's cultural identity. That's just as important as learning how to read and write and how to do math, because we're developing individuals, right? I mean, that's the comprehensive part of this, right? Is that we're not just sort of teaching kids how to read and write and calculate and add and subtract, that we're also building their character. And we have to honor people's identities. We have to honor our students' identity in their cultural backgrounds. That's the comprehensive part of this, right? In terms of it being multidimensional, right? Here's the idea, right? That it involves many different things. Yes, curriculum content is a big part of that, but it also includes the learning context itself, various different learning styles, the climate in the classroom, right? The teacher-student relationships. Again, going back to this idea that if your students don't trust you, then they're not going to learn very well. They're not going to, they're just not going to feel like that they, belong in that classroom, right? The different instructional techniques that we use, whether or not it's, again, there's different learning styles. People sort of understand that already. And then even in terms of this multidimensional component is that the different way that we assess and the different ways that we evaluate students, right? If we only care about whether or not that they get it right or wrong, we're not helping our students. There's more to just getting it right or wrong. And there's different ways to assess students and their abilities and their knowledge, right? In terms of it being empowering, it kind of goes along as well as this sort of validating part of it, right? Again, when we engage in culturally relevant teaching, this empowers students just to be better human beings and to be more sort of proficient as individuals and, diverse peoples and so on. It also sort of sends a message that, that they can succeed, that they can believe in themselves. That's the empowering part of that, right? In terms of it being motivational, transformative, right? The idea here, right, is that, students become culturally responsive and they're able to make, these reflective decisions, and then kind of implement their decisions to be effective, both personal, social, political, economic. I mean, all of these sort of things come together, and we can use those in different ways and different lessons within the classroom, from the K through the, 12, or even pre-K through, 12 education and so on, right? I mean, we're trying to, build good human beings in our classrooms, right? And then last part here, in terms of it being emancipatory, this kind of puts everything all together, right? I mean, in terms of, freeing ourselves from the simple paradigm or the Western model of education as being the only way to do things, right? That there's multiple different ways, right? And then once we sort of engage in this culturally relevant teaching, it allows people and allows ourselves as educators as well to sort of free ourselves from that mindset, right? That there's one way to do it, and that, our students need to be fixed in some way, right? That's how oppression works, right? We need to liberate ourselves and emancipate ourselves from that sort of, simple mindset and so on, right? Okay, so that's sort of the, culturally relevant teaching in a nutshell. So what's the evidence? Let's jump into some of that here real quick, and then we'll try to open it up for questions here. There's a little bit more in terms of, school environments and so on, and I can come back to that in a little bit here, but let me jump ahead here just a few slides, so we make sure I get through everything here in enough time. So this leads to the idea of creating identity safe, campuses, classrooms, and so on. The idea here, right, is that, the classroom and the environment need to be as congruent and culturally congruent as possible in order for our Native students, all students really, to succeed and to be successful, no matter how you define that, right? Whether that's grades or just graduating from high school, fitting in, finding a place, and so on, right? It helps free us from the identity of social identity threat, which is, stereotyping and prejudice and things like that there. And the way that we do that is through representation, right? So there was another study that Stephanie Freiberg did, where she, did this experiment, and try to look at these different models of success. And I'm going to quickly go through this. So stick with me here. So she had four different layers, I guess, to the study, right? Where she had American Indian students, non-Native students, come in, and they were primed in terms of these models for success, where they saw someone who looked like them, that was getting an education either to help themselves, someone who looked like them that was getting an education to help their community, or someone who didn't look like them who was getting an education to help themselves. Everybody with me on that? And I'll show you what that means here in a second, right? And then there was a no prime model or control group where they didn't, get any of these primes. So here's what the prime was. If they showed a picture of someone, and then they were given the statement, getting an education will benefit you in the future. This is an independent model, meaning, again, it's going to help me. And then you have an out-group member. This is a Native person would see a non-Native person in an academic setting. Everybody with me on that? So this is an independent model, out-group member, prime. And then they were given this. And then they were asked some questions after this. I'll get to those in a second. Or they were given this prime. Again, getting an education will benefit you in the future, but here you see a Native person who looks like you, but the idea is that they're getting an education just to help themselves. That's an independent model. I remember, again, going back to the independent versus interdependent sort of frame, right? Or they were given this prime. Again, you see a Native person, looks like you, but they're getting an education to help their tribe or to help their community in the future. This is the interdependent model, in-group member. And then so they were given this prime, or they were given no prime at all. They were just, and then they were asked questions about their motivation for success, their academic achievement, and things like that there. And here's basically what they found, right? So here's the effect of having a prime, something like that, again, which just goes back to representation, on students' motivation for school. And you can clearly see, looking at the bars here, that the prime that has the most powerful effect in terms of student motivation is the interdependent model when you see a Native person who looks like you. Everybody with me on that, especially compared to the independent outgroup member. When you see a non-native person who's just getting an education for themselves, which is typically what we see in the typical school setting, right? That has the least impact in terms of motivating students to do better, native students. But over here, when you see a native person getting an education, and they're getting an education to help their tribe or their community, that has the most powerful effect on students' motivation. Everybody with me on that? Okay. Similarly, she asked, in terms of their academic engagement, which, one of these conditions is going to have the most impact or the most powerful effect in terms of academic engagement. Again, we see a similar pattern here, actually, whether or not you see a native person getting an education for themselves or you see a native person getting an education to help their tribe, it has a similar impact in terms of their impact on their engagement in academics, versus especially not seeing or seeing a non-native person just getting an education for themselves. Again, so this simple study, again, shows us how important representation is. And in addition, how important the framing of that representation is if it's framed in a more collectivistic, interdependent perspective, meaning that if I get my education to help my people, that is more powerful than just getting an education to help yourself, which is what we typically, that's the standard Western model, if we're being honest, right? So again, this is a simple study that really just shows you how important it is to have the proper representation of having native people present in the curriculum, in the classroom, on the walls, around campus, right, in the schools, how important and how powerful that actually is in terms of motivating and getting students engaged in the classroom, right? So this is, the data speaks for itself. It's right there, right? We could go on in terms of looking at specific types of curriculum. There's not a lot with Native people specifically, but these other ones sort of point to the importance of this as well too. Raza studies, for folks who are not familiar with Raza studies, this is the Mexican American studies, primarily down in the Southwest. Arizona adopted this a long time ago. Just recently, though, their legislature is trying to outlaw this, but that's another story. But they found that, when Mexican American students, Chicana students take Raza studies in their school, that it helped, they increases their graduation rates. Just taking the Raza studies class, right? Again, this is what the Maori people, indigenous people over in New Zealand, the positive student-teacher relationships, again, increases academic engagement in the classroom. I have the references here. You can go and get these studies yourself, and when you get the slides, and you can look at this more in depth. I'm going to quickly go through a few more here so I can have a few questions here at the end. Similar with African American students, again, culturally relevant, right? Using books and materials that represent them when they're reading something about Malcolm X, that they can incorporate that with their own African American culture. It helps them read better, and it of course improves reading scores overall across the curriculum, right? Again, even with science, right? There was this really cool study in terms of rethinking pedagogy in an urban setting using hip hop pedagogy. If you're not familiar with hip hop, it's the idea that where you have this call and response, which is big in hip hop. When rappers, they'll say something and then the audience repeats back. Using that kind of pedagogy in the classroom helped the students engage with their science material more, Black students in particular, right? Again, it's culturally relevant, it's important. Similarly, even with, Middle Eastern, Iraqi students who are refugees learning English as a second language, when it's framed in a culturally relevant way, they do better, they get better, right, in terms of their academic performance. Here's one that's really powerful as well too, this ethnic, having one ethnic studies class in high school. This was done in California, where it increased attendance by 21% for those students of color. It increased their GPAs by 1.4%, right? And then it increased the students' credits earned from 9th grade to 11th grade by 23. This study was so powerful, in fact, that this is what led to the ethnic studies requirement in the state of California. There was a few problems with it here and there. Folks from California probably know what I'm talking about, but it's finally getting pushed through, which is powerful, right? I wish that Minnesota would do something like this. We have these other funky standards. I'm not even going to get to it. 7th grade science. It works across all kinds of different areas, right? Where, again, you have culturally relevant teaching led to higher gains. versus standard-based sort of methods, increase positive attitudes towards science. Here's one that's specifically with American Indian, Alaska Natives, actually more specifically, that was done by a friend of mine, Jerry Lipka, up in Alaska. I used to work up in Alaska for about 3 years, about 12, 13, 14 years ago now, where they developed these culturally relevant teaching modules, primarily for K through 5 and 6th grade. And here's just 2 of them. They actually, if you, I'll give you the link for this as well too, and you can go find this yourselves. They have these 2 modules in particular: picking berries, and then going to Egg Island to gather eggs with grandma, right? And then using these modules with grade schoolers increase math performance by this much in terms of standard deviations. And again, for you non-statistical folks, a 0.82 standard deviation in terms of effect size, and even a 0.39 is a very powerful effect. That's a really, really strong effect. If you can increase test scores in math by that much, you're doing something right, right? So several examples there. There's another thing that I have to say that, which is really important as well too, is the idea of of having representation in the classroom, having a native teacher or a teacher of color at the front of the classroom, and how powerful that actually is. And the research again shows over and over again that when a native student or a student of color has a teacher who looks like them, that it has a powerful effect in terms of their academic engagement and their academic performance. And here's just several studies that show you how powerful that effect actually is, right? The last 2 in particular are really, really significant, right? There was a study, and there was a few that's been done since this, where in 2017, there was a study that showed just having 1 Black teacher increase high school graduation by more than 30%, particularly for African-American boys, right? And the crazy thing is that the most powerful it was when they had that teacher in their grade school, even before high school, right? And then there's a really significant study that was done over in the Menominee Nation, which is over in Wisconsin, where they went from about 60% graduation rates in their tribal school. They hired a lot more native teachers, and then they got that graduation rate up to almost 90% or so now, right? So again, really, really powerful examples that show, how important these things really, really are, right? I know we're running a little bit short on time. There's a couple of more slides that I could sort of go over, but once, basically, just 15 culturally relevant teaching strategies and examples. There's 2 slides here for you. You can look at these yourselves once you get the slides sent to you via email and so on. I want to actually stop sharing my screen right now, and I know we have a few minutes here for questions. So let me go ahead and stop and then open it up for questions. I haven't even been looking at the chat. I see that there's a bunch of stuff in the chat. So I'm like a dog. If I start looking at that, it's like squirrel, I don't even try to go there. So I'll try to look at it after here. So let me stop sharing my screen and then I'll open it up for questions for folks. All right. I know I talk a little bit fast because there's so much to talk about. But any thoughts, questions, comments, folks?
There's been a lot of great discussion in the chat, a lot of great suggestions and support for one another. So I thank you all for sharing. But this isn't a time to be shy. We have a few minutes left. So if you have something that you did not put in the chat, or that you did that you want to share with everybody to make sure everybody gets it, this is your chance. You're welcome to unmute yourself.
Yeah, this is Jeff Couchy. Yeah, it's great presentation. I'm glad you're able to show some of the statistics on the grade levels on the cultural awareness and of the Native Americans, Alaska Natives. The numbers does seem accurate, and it does apply to a lot of the villages here in Alaska. And the reason why is because of the child development and early stages of watching, learning, seeing, doing, and then further progressing to helping out and assisting in some of our culture here. And then you made a good point on applying our culture to curriculum such as mathematics. The dimensions of a drum, the number of skin that may be needed to apply to the drum. And you know, towards the end of your presentation, it was great to see the modules that were being developed. And, you know, these modules are fantastic because, you know, it is a written curriculum on how to pick berries, on going out and, you know, going looking for eggs. And then presenting it to the students or the child or the youth, and then actually doing it is a wonderful tool. And it's you know, it'd be good for all kinds of, you know, applying curriculum to our culture. So that's a great, I was happy to see the numbers, and I was also happy to see the modules that you showed briefly.
Yeah, Koyana, thanks so much. You know, I remember, you know, I was and I worked at the University of Alaska for 3 years up there, and that's how I met Jerry Lipka up there in it. They have a whole bunch of other modules as well too that they develop, and then you can, I mean, you can quickly search through that and find those for folks who are interested. And I think those can easily be adapted as well too to other cultural contexts as well too, right? I mean, it does. I mean, lots of Native people pick berries, right? I mean, there's berries everywhere. I mean, you know, we go out and we harvest and gather things, and I mean, even farming. And I remember when I was out in one of the villages of Luckenock out there, and there was one teacher that was using math to you know, make kayaks, right? I mean, that's a culturally relevant tool that, you know, especially those river tribes and those coastal tribes. I mean, you know, you have to have a kayak. You need a kayak. You use a kayak all the time. There's math, that's math and science. It's embedded within how to build a kayak and how to use a kayak, and all of that knowledge just kind of goes along with that, right? I mean, there's just so much of existing knowledge that Native people have, especially around science, right? You know, that just underutilized, right? I mean, you know, my medallion here, the medicine circle, right? This medicine wheel. I mean, this is science. There's science in terms of seasons, circles of life, the cycles of life, the directions. I mean, it's, you know, people sort of look, you know, non-Native people sort of look at this and sort of see this as a, you know, a nice, pretty, you know, artwork and medallion, but it's based on science, right? I mean, Native people, you know, the 4 elements, right? Air, wind, earth, fire, right? Water. Native people know that this is what makes us human beings, right? We're 90% water. We need water. Water is life, right? Fire, you know, my elders taught me this a long time ago, right? That, you know, those, the firing of synapses and neurons, there's an electrical spark that's happening in our brain. We're made of fire. That's happening right now as we speak, right? The breath we're breathing, that's the wind, that's the air. You know, we're carbon beings. We have earth within us. I mean, that's, again, that's Native science right there. You know, I mean, it's much, much deeper than sort of just this simple, superficial things that we're taught in our schools. And you got me going here. I'm going to stop talking. Any other questions? I'm sorry.
Again, lots of great interaction here on the chat. And so Dr. Gonzalez, as before, I'll share all this with you so you can see some of the suggestions
Great.
and comments, questions. A lot of people saying how grateful they are for this opportunity. And so as we get ready to close with today, if I can remember how to share my screen correctly, I'm going to put the URL again here in the chat and then share my screen with hopefully the correct slide this time. There's a QR code that's listed there for anybody who's tech savvy enough and wants to do the survey that capacity. I have our contact information here on the screen for several of our staff members. If you have further questions about today's program, comments, questions, anything that you need, resources, a lot of you asked for different resources. And when we get the slide deck ready to get sent out with the recording, I'm going to include a list of resources because I know Dr. Gonzalez has a lot of great information that he shared. And a lot of you were asking, where did he get that? Where's that study? How can I get my hands on it? We want to make sure you have access to that. So please be mindful. We're going to put together a list of resources to include with that when we send it out.
All right. Miigwech, everybody. I got to run to another meeting here. So thanks so much. Koyana. Aho, washte.